I want you to picture walking into an apartment the day after a tenant moves out, the same apartment your property manager just charged that tenant $800 for extensive carpet damage requiring full replacement, and finding the exact same carpet still on the floor, clean, unremarkable, and clearly never replaced at all. It's the kind of thing that could mean nothing, a scheduling delay, a miscommunication between the office and the vendor, some boring administrative explanation waiting just underneath the surface. Or it could mean something else entirely, and the only way to know which is to keep noticing, unit after unit, until the pattern either resolves into coincidence or refuses to. This is the story of Jasmine Ortiz, a leasing consultant who noticed that same carpet a little too many times to still call it a coincidence. Jasmine Ortiz was 29 years old, and she'd worked as a leasing consultant at the Aldridge, a mid-sized apartment community managed by Fairview Residential Management, for just over 2 years. Part of her job involved walking vacated units before they went back on the market, noting real condition, coordinating with maintenance and outside vendors on any actual repairs needed, and preparing units to be shown to new prospective tenants. The property's manager was a man named Brad Sullivan, 45, who'd run the Aldridge for 5 years and had final authority over move-out inspections and any deductions taken from a departing tenant's security deposit. Brad had a reputation among corporate leadership as efficient and detail-oriented. His property consistently reported some of the highest deposit deduction recovery in the region, numbers that, from a purely financial reporting standpoint, made his community look like it was being managed unusually well. Jasmine's first year, she had no particular reason to question Brad's move-out assessments. Apartment damage disputes are common in property management. Tenants and managers frequently disagree about what counts as normal wear versus actual damage, and Brad's assessments, while consistently thorough, didn't initially strike her as anything other than diligent. If anything, she genuinely respected him during that first year. He was patient with difficult tenants in a way a lot of property managers weren't. He covered maintenance emergencies personally when the on-call tech was unavailable, and corporate leadership regularly held up the Aldridge's numbers as a model for how a well-run community should perform financially, which reflected well on everyone working there, Jasmine included. It was in her second year, walking a unit the day after a tenant had been charged $800 for carpet replacement, due to what the move-out report described as extensive staining and wear beyond normal use, that she noticed the carpet in question looked completely ordinary, clean, unremarkable, showing nothing that resembled the kind of damage that would justify full replacement, and certainly showing no sign of having actually been replaced in the roughly 18 hours since the tenant's charge had been finalized. She assumed, at first, that maybe the replacement was simply scheduled for later in the week rather than already completed, and that the charge had gone out ahead of the actual work. But when she checked the unit again 10 days later, preparing it for a new tenant's move-in walkthrough, the carpet was still the same one, unreplaced, still in the same ordinary condition it had been in when the previous tenant supposedly left it in a state requiring full replacement. That discrepancy alone might have stayed a one-off oddity in her mind, except that a similar pattern surfaced again 2 months later on a different unit, a move-out charge for significant wall damage requiring repainting and drywall repair, $600 deducted from that tenant's deposit, and a unit that, when Jasmine walked it before the XT tenant's move-in, showed walls in ordinary, unremarkable condition, with no visible sign of repainting having actually occurred. She stood in that unit longer than she needed to for her actual job, running a hand along a wall that was supposedly freshly repaired, feeling the same faint, unsettled recognition she'd felt with the carpet 2 months earlier, except now it was harder to dismiss as a single strange coincidence. She started paying closer attention after that, quietly, without mentioning anything to Brad directly, since she didn't yet have anything more substantial than an odd feeling and 2 units that looked fine. Over the following months, she began keeping her own informal log, noting every move-out deduction Brad approved for damage beyond normal wear, then comparing her own notes from the subsequent move-in walkthrough to see whether the claimed repair actually appeared to have happened. It became a habit she performed almost without deciding to. the way a task can quietly turn into a routine once curiosity settles into something closer to method. The pattern, once she'd tracked it across roughly a year, was consistent and substantial. Of 31 move-out deposit deductions Brad had approved for damage repairs during that period, she found clear evidence that at least 22 of the claimed repairs had never actually been performed, based on her own direct observation of the units during subsequent move-in walkthroughs. The units simply looked the same as they had before the supposed repair, not visibly damaged in the way the deduction claimed, and not visibly repaired either. Every single one of these deductions had been processed through the same named vendor on the invoice paperwork, a company called Sullivan Restoration Services. Jasmine hadn't thought much of the vendor name the first several times she'd seen it on paperwork, since Sullivan is a common enough surname, and property management companies use dozens of vendors with names Jasmine had never had reason to research. But once the pattern of unperformed repairs became too consistent to ignore, she looked up Sullivan Restoration Services' business registration out of simple curiosity, the same kind of basic due diligence she was technically allowed to run on any vendor for reconciliation purposes. The company had been registered 4 years earlier. Its registered owner was listed as Brad Sullivan. She sat with that discovery for several days, working through exactly what it meant and how confident she actually was before deciding what to do with it. Brad wasn't simply approving inflated repair invoices from an outside contractor who happened to be defrauding the property. He was, according to the company's own public registration, the direct owner of the vendor, being paid for repairs that, in the majority of cases she'd been able to verify, appeared to have never actually taken place at all. There was one afternoon, a few weeks into her quiet cross-checking, when Brad stopped by the leasing office while she had her informal log open on her screen, a simple spreadsheet with unit numbers and dates, nothing overtly labeled. "Getting a jump on the occupancy report?" he asked, glancing at it without much apparent interest. "Just keeping my move-in notes organized," Jasmine said, which was true enough on its face, and closed the window a moment after he'd walked back to his own office, aware of how close that had felt, even though nothing about the exchange had actually given anything away. She mentioned the situation once, in careful generalities, to a friend from a previous job who now worked in commercial real estate compliance, someone who understood property management vendor relationships well enough to give useful perspective without needing every specific detail. If a manager owns the vendor doing the repairs, that's a related party transaction that should have been disclosed to corporate from day one, her friend told her over that e-phone. The fact that it wasn't disclosed is almost as telling as whether the repairs actually happened. Document everything you can verify with your own eyes first. That's the part nobody can argue with later. That distinction stuck with Jasmine, and shaped, more than anything else, how she chose to build the rest of her case around her own direct observations, rather than anything she couldn't personally verify. She calculated the scope as best she could, with the data available to her. 22 confirmed unperformed repairs over roughly a year, averaging around $700 each in deposit deductions, came to just over $15,000 for that year alone. Extending the same rate across Brad's full 5 years managing the property, the number, if the pattern had held consistently, could plausibly exceed $260,000 in improperly withheld tenant deposits. She still didn't have proof beyond her own observations of unit condition, which, she understood, someone skeptical could argue was simply her own imprecise assessment rather than definitive evidence that no repair had occurred. She needed something more concrete than her own eyes before bringing this forward, so she began, carefully, photographing units during her routine move-in walkthroughs going forward, not obviously targeting Brad's disputed deductions specifically, just quietly expanding her normal documentation habits to include time-stamped photos of every unit's actual condition, which was, on its face, simply good practice for a leasing consultant to have anyway. Over the following 2 months, she built a growing archive of dated photos covering 9 more units where Brad had approved a Sullivan Restoration Services charge. each one showing the same pattern she'd noticed with the very first carpet. Ordinary condition, no visible sign of either the claimed damage or the claimed repair. She also started paying closer attention to the actual maintenance request history for each unit, which she had routine access to as part of coordinating between leasing and the maintenance team. If Sullivan Restoration Services had genuinely performed carpet replacement or drywall repair, there should have been a corresponding work order logged in the property's maintenance system, even for outside vendor work, since Fairview's own policy required all vendor work to be tracked centrally for insurance and liability purposes. On the majority of the flagged units, no such work order existed at all, meaning not only did the unit show no physical evidence of repair, but the property's own internal systems showed no record that any work had ever been scheduled or dispatched. She cross-referenced this against the actual invoices Brad had approved for payment, which, as a leasing consultant with reconciliation duties, she had legitimate routine access to. Every invoice was formatted professionally, itemized with labor hours and material costs that looked entirely plausible on their face, dated appropriately relative to the move-out and move-in schedule, and signed off with Brad's own approval. Nothing about the paperwork itself, taken alone, would have raised any flag at all. It was only by holding the paperwork up against the physical reality of the units themselves, and against the maintenance system's own independent record of dispatched work, that the gap became visible. Before she'd built a fully airtight photographic case, a tenant who'd been charged for the same kind of fabricated carpet damage called the corporate office directly to dispute the charge, frustrated enough to escalate past the property level entirely, rather than simply accept Brad's assessment. The tenant, a woman who'd lived at the Aldridge for nearly 3 years without a single complaint, had moved out for a job relocation and was, according to the notes eventually attached to her file, particularly insistent because she'd taken her own photos of the apartment before leaving, a habit she'd developed after a bad experience with a previous landlord years earlier. An ordinary precaution that happened in this case to matter enormously. The complaint landed with Fairview's Regional Director of Property Operations, a woman named Carol Bennington, who requested that someone at the property level document the actual current condition of the unit in question before responding to the tenant's dispute. Carol's request was routine, the kind of basic verification step that should have been standard practice long before any tenant needed to escalate a complaint to force it. That request landed on Jasmine's desk, since documenting unit condition was routinely her responsibility. She photographed the unit thoroughly, confirmed the carpet was in ordinary condition, showing no sign of the damage or replacement described in the original charge, and recognized this as exactly the moment to bring forward everything she'd quietly gathered, rather than simply submitting the one requested photo set and letting the broader pattern stay buried under a single resolved dispute. She sent Carol a careful message alongside the requested documentation. I've attached the current unit photos as requested. I also want to flag that I've identified a broader pattern of move-out damage charges tied to a vendor with an ownership connection to Brad, where the claimed repairs don't appear to have actually been performed. I have documentation going back roughly a year, and would like to discuss it before this tenant's dispute is resolved. Carol called her within the hour. "Walk me through how you first noticed this," Carol asked, before getting into the specifics of the file itself. Jasmine explained the first carpet, then the wall, then the growing informal log, then, finally, the vendor registration search that had connected Sullivan Restoration Services directly to Brad. Carol listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a clarifying question about dates or specific units. The careful, methodical questioning of someone building her own mental timeline in real time, rather than simply accepting Jasmine's conclusions at face value. Jasmine laid out her file in the clearest order she could manage, the specific tenant's dispute and her fresh photographic evidence first, since it was the most immediate and concrete, then her broader year of observations across the other 21 units, then the vendor ownership connection to Brad, framed with appropriate care. I want to be clear about what I can prove versus what I'm inferring. I can prove Sullivan Restoration Services is registered to Brad. I can prove, from my own walkthrough documentation, that a majority of the claimed repairs paid to that company don't appear to have actually happened. I can't prove intent beyond what that pattern strongly suggests, and I think that's a determination for people with more authority than I have. Carol reviewed the timeline and the vendor registration carefully, cross-checking the ownership record herself against the state's business filing database, while Jasmine waited on the call. "This is far more than one tenant's dispute," she said, once she'd confirmed the registration matched what Jasmine had described. "I need to bring this to finance and legal immediately. Please don't discuss any of this with Brad. And continue your normal walkthrough documentation exactly as you have been." What happened over the following days moved quickly once Fairview's corporate office was actually looking at the pattern directly. An audit of every deposit deduction tied to Sullivan Restoration Services across Brad's full 5 years at the property confirmed the scope was consistent with what Jasmine had estimated, and in several cases worse, since a handful of older deductions before Jasmine's own tenure showed the same pattern going back even further than she'd had visibility into. The investigation also uncovered something Jasmine hadn't been positioned to find on her own. Brad had occasionally used Sullivan Restoration Services for a small number of genuinely real, necessary repairs as well, apparently specifically to make the vendor relationship look legitimate on paper and give the company a plausible operating history if anyone ever looked closely, a detail that made the fraud considerably harder to spot at a casual glance than if every single invoice from the company had been fabricated. Auditors also found that Brad had structured the scheme to specifically target tenants who were unlikely to formally dispute a deposit charge, those moving out of state, those relocating for a new job with limited time to fight a few $100s, or those who'd expressed during their tenancy that they didn't plan to rent from Fairview again and therefore had less incentive to maintain a good relationship with the company by staying quiet. It was a deliberate pattern of choosing victims least likely to push back, refined, investigators believed, over years of watching which tenants complained and which simply paid the charge and moved on. The one tenant whose complaint had finally escalated things past the property level had, notably, been an exception to that careful targeting, someone who'd otherwise had a smooth 3-year tenancy and no obvious reason, on paper, to be expected to fight back this particular time, which investigators later suggested might simply have been Brad growing slightly less careful after years of the scheme going unquestioned. The same kind of complacency that seems to eventually catch up with almost every long-running scheme once its architect stops expecting anyone to actually check. Brad Sullivan was terminated within 2 weeks of Carol's initial review, with Fairview pursuing civil recovery of the improperly withheld deposit amounts specifically for redistribution back to the affected former tenants, going back as far as records allowed the company to identify and locate them. Given the scale of the fraud and its direct impact on consumers rather than only the company itself, Fairview's legal team also referred the matter to the state's Consumer Protection Division, given that fabricated damage charges against tenants carried separate regulatory implications beyond ordinary employee theft. The tenant whose original dispute had escalated things to Carol's attention received a full refund of her disputed charge, along with a formal written apology from Fairview's corporate office, and later told Jasmine, in an email Jasmine kept long after the whole matter was resolved, that she'd almost not bothered escalating the complaint at all, assuming a few $100s wasn't worth the hassle of arguing with a property management company. She'd only pushed it because she happened to have her own photos, taken out of an old habit from a bad landlord years earlier, and said she was glad, in hindsight, that the habit had finally paid off for someone other than just herself. News of Brad's termination moved through the property's small staff quickly, the way it always does, and reactions were mixed in a way Jasmine found more unsettling than she expected. Several longtime maintenance staff, who genuinely liked working under Brad day to day, struggled to reconcile the person they knew with what the investigation had found, a reaction Jasmine understood completely, since she'd struggled with exactly the same thing herself for months before the pattern became undeniable. Jasmine was credited clearly for the discovery once Carol explained to the regional leadership team exactly how the pattern had surfaced through one leasing consultant's quiet insistence on actually looking at units herself rather than simply trusting a manager's damage assessment on paper. She was promoted into an expanded resident services role with new authority to independently document and verify any move-out deduction above a certain dollar threshold before it would be finalized, a safeguard that would have caught the entire scheme years earlier had it existed from the start. The promotion came with a broader mandate than Jasmine initially expected, reviewing not just future move-out charges, but auditing the historical file for every current tenant to identify anyone who might still be owed a partial refund on an active lease, since Brad's pattern hadn't been limited to move-out deposits alone. In 2 cases, the audit found that current tenants had been charged for in-tenancy repairs tied to the same shell vendor, charges quietly added to their monthly statements rather than deducted from a deposit, meaning the scheme had been even more flexible in how it extracted money than Jasmine's original deposit-focused investigation had captured. Some weeks later, training a new leasing consultant on the updated move-out documentation process, Jasmine found herself explaining why every claimed damage repair now required a follow-up photo confirming the repair had actually been completed, not just an invoice claiming it had. Because for years, all it took to keep someone's deposit was writing down that something was damaged and then paying yourself to supposedly fix it, she said. Nobody thought to check whether the fix ever actually happened. Now, the photo has to match the invoice every time before the deposit deduction is final. The new consultant asked, reasonably, whether requiring photo confirmation on every single repair wasn't going to slow down turning units around for new tenants. A little, Jasmine admitted, but the alternative is trusting an invoice from whoever the manager decided to hire, and we already know exactly how long that kind of trust can get quietly taken advantage of before a tenant angry enough to escalate past the property level happens to be the one who finally exposes it. A few extra minutes with a camera is a small price for making sure the charge and the room actually match. She still walks every disputed unit herself before finalizing any damage deduction over a certain threshold, a habit that started as quiet, anxious curiosity about one carpet and became, over time, simply the standard she holds the whole property to. She says, when people ask her about it now, that the hardest part was never actually noticing the pattern. Carpets and invoices either match reality or they don't, and if you keep looking carefully enough, they eventually tell you which one it is. The hardest part was the months she spent unsure whether she was imagining a pattern that wasn't really there, before she had enough photographs to know for certain she wasn't, all while working every day alongside someone she genuinely liked and respected, uncertain how she'd ever be able to look at him the same way once she knew, and equally uncertain what it would mean for her own job if it turned out she was wrong. It turned out the pattern was real. It usually is, once it gets specific and consistent enough to stop looking like coincidence, and once someone is patient enough and quietly stubborn enough to keep checking instead of talking themselves out of what they'd already seen with their own eyes. If you've ever had a nagging feeling that something you were told happened didn't quite match what you could see with your own eyes, and let someone's authority talk you out of trusting that observation, trust it anyway and go look again. Paperwork can claim anything. A camera pointed at the actual room usually can't lie the same way. Oh, keep your file, keep your receipts. The truth is usually sitting right there in the room, waiting for someone to actually walk in and look.